defied a court order, while Vice President Vance has suggested that judges do not have the authority over Trump's executive power. Now, could this signal the start of a constitutional crisis? Harvard Law professor and Bloomberg columnist Noah Feldman joins Walter Isaacson to break it all down.
Thank you, Paula and Noah Feldman. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Walter.
Yesterday, a federal judge said that the Trump administration had defied the court's order to release billions of dollars in grants that were supposed to go out. Tell me what you think the significance of this is.
It's still not clear whether the administration was consciously defying that order or, as it were, casually defying it. I know that sounds like it might not make a big difference, but it actually does. Since 1865, no president has refused to follow a direct order from a federal court. And so if the president says, I'm defying it, that puts us closer to what you might call a constitutional crisis. But if the administration is just dragging its feet and goes into court and says, well, we thought you meant a different order, which is what they said here, and then the court says, no, I told you to restart the funding. If they say, as the administration has said, okay, we're going to appeal, we're angry, we're going to appeal, that's okay. What's not okay is to say, we, the administration, are going to ignore an order of an Article III court.
But let me read to you something that Vice President J.D. Vance posted over the weekend, which seems a bit concerning. He wrote, if a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the Attorney General in how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges are not allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. I thought they were allowed to control it, or is the word legitimate power something I'm missing?
J.D. Vance is using what lawyers call technically weasel words there. He's trying to say something that in literal legal terms is sort of kind of true, but that is extremely misleading in terms of the way he phrased it. Because the way it's supposed to work, the way it does work under our system, is that it's up to the courts to say what the law is. And then it's up to the executive branch to execute the law as the courts have said it is. So if the court says that the president has exceeded his executive power, then he has, and he has to stop. Now, there's a body of law about when the president has exceeded his executive power, and if a court were to ignore the whole body of law and reach a decision that contradicted it, we would say in ordinary English, they got it wrong. But the president would still have to listen to them. So what J.D. Vance is doing there is he's making it sound as though someone other than the courts could say, you got it wrong, so what you did was illegal. And that's not the ordinary English meaning.
Wishy-washy, making up their own laws.
But technically, Vance can say, well, I'm not saying we should defy the court's orders. I'm just saying they would have been wrong. And in order to say they would be really wrong, I use the word illegal. So what he's doing is he's undermining the legitimacy of the proper system using weasel words.
Explain to me how the courts, I guess way back when Justice Marshall did Marbury versus Madison, got the power to decide what laws mean and what the executives have to do to enforce them.
Well, you're absolutely right, Walter, that this goes all the way back to 1803 and one of the most famous Supreme Court cases ever, Marbury against Madison, as you said, in which Chief Justice Marshall said, the power of the courts is the power to say what the law is, even when that law contradicts the Constitution, and then they will say it's unconstitutional. So that's why that's such a famous case. And by saying that the courts have the power to make a law unconstitutional, he was also saying, we, the courts, have the final word on what the meaning of the law is, and everyone else in the government has to listen to us. And although there have been one or two moments in our history, the very early part of our history, where presidents were a little ambivalent about listening to the courts about that, it's been very well established, certainly since the end of the Civil War, and in even clearer terms since the end of the Civil Rights Movement, that when the court speaks, that's the law, and the president has to listen the same way President Eisenhower did when he listened to the courts and sent airborne troops to Little Rock to integrate the schools.
One of the presidents that Trump reminds me of is Andrew Jackson in some ways. And, of course, Andrew Jackson famously said of Chief Justice Marshall after the Supreme Court had made the decision about preventing Cherokee Indian removals, he said, well, Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So what happens if the courts get defied? How do they enforce it?
I will say, like you, Walter, I was raised on that story. there's now some question about whether he actually literally said that, but the idea is consistent no matter what. And the idea is that the courts don't have a police force that works for them. They don't have an army that works for them. So in our system, the rule of law depends on the president and the executive branch actually obeying what the courts say. That's a fundamental, a foundational principle of our constitutional order. And the Jackson story is there to remind us that if a president doesn't do that, we don't have a great check. You know, historically, I would have said, oh, you impeach a president who doesn't listen. We tried to impeach President Trump twice. He was impeached both times, but not convicted either time. So we realized that's not as powerful a tool as the framers wanted it to be. So we want to avoid a situation like that. And I just want to emphasize, we're not there yet. I'm not saying that that can't happen. You know, not only am I not a prophet, but no one wise would prophesy about Donald Trump. But he was president for 4 years, and in that period of time, he did not directly defy any court orders. And so I'm hopeful that the administration won't do it this time either.
Yeah, you wrote that Trump never really defied a court order, and you said, just as you did just now, that you're hopeful. What makes you hopeful?
What makes me hopeful is partly incentives. You know, Trump appointed 3 justices of the current Supreme Court, and he's got at least 3 more who are often sympathetic to the conservative position. So he can win important cases in front of the Supreme Court, unless he defies the authority of the judiciary as a whole. Because the one thing all 9 of those justices have in common is their importance and their power derives from being justices of the Supreme Court. And so if he flouts the judiciary, he's flouting the justices, and he's going to lose the Supreme Court. And that would be extremely unwise. Now, I can almost hear you thinking, this is Donald Trump, so why is unwisdom a reasonable predictor? And I hear that loud and clear. But I also think that it would enmesh the country in a huge debate about what would probably in practice be a relatively small matter. Not that the closure of USAID stays small to those who receive the money, but in the grand scheme of the government of the United States, it's not the hugest part of the government. And so to get into a fight with the courts over something like that and to lose all of his authority with respect to the judiciary would, I think, even for Donald Trump, be counterproductive.
Let me get to the very specific case right now about the freezing of federal grants and funds and the court ordering them to unfreeze it, and ask again the question of enforcement. If indeed they say unfreeze the funds and the president and his agency heads just don't send the money out, what could happen? I mean, how could that be forced?
Well, a court has a bunch of tools at its disposal, and the court thus far used a pretty gentle tool. It sort of prodded the executive and said, we told you, now do this. But if the executive doesn't listen, the court can order monetary damages against the government. And in an extreme situation, it could identify the relevant official and order that official individually to carry out his or her job in dispersing the money. And if the official didn't do it, I don't think it's outside the bounds of possibility the judiciary could issue an order directed at that person, with the consequence that the person could be in contempt of court if they don't follow it, which in theory could mean that such a person could actually be put in jail or subject to individual fines until they perform their job. I hope it doesn't come to that.
Let me read you something that Chief Justice John Roberts said a few weeks ago in his end-of-year report. And he's going to be the person that we're all going to be watching when these cases get to the court, of whether he has the sense of an independent judiciary from the Trump administration. He said, within the past few years, elected officials from across the political spectrum have raised the specter of open disregard for federal court rulings. These dangerous suggestions, however sporadic, must be soundly rejected. And now we've heard in the past few weeks some of these same suggestions. Do you think that Chief Justice Roberts is intimating that these type of things have to be soundly rejected?
I do, and the Chief Justice cares a lot about the legitimacy and effectiveness of the court as a court. And it's been hard for him because this court is so polarized, like the country is polarized, that it's undermined the court's legitimacy. And that's what he thinks about when he wakes up in the morning and what he thinks about before he goes to bed at night, preserving the legitimacy of the institution that he's in charge of. That said, you know, he has not been shy about speaking out, and he did it in the first Trump administration when he thought that Trump was questioning the independence of the judiciary. And if necessary, I think he'd be confident to do it again. You know, there's an interesting quirk here, which is that the same J.D. Vance, the vice president, who's been making these statements that are, I think, in intent and in effect supposed to undermine the judiciary, he's married to a woman who's a very brilliant lawyer who was a law clerk for the Chief Justice. And my sense is that Vance is probably smart enough to run these statements by his wife before he makes them public to ask, is this narrowly enough within the technical bounds of what is legal to not, get a rebuke from the court? And he's just inside the line right now. But I think if he goes further, or President Trump does, there's evidence to suggest from the past that the Chief Justice will speak out. And most importantly, all of the justices do believe in the importance of maintaining the rule of law. Even if they don't agree with the decision of a lower court and they might overturn it, they still think it has to be followed until it's overturned.
One of the things that the Trump administration seems to have done is firing the dozens of prosecutors that worked on the January 6 cases. In other words, the cases involving the insurrection at Capitol Hill on January 6th. And the Department of Justice has demanded a list of FBI agents who worked on that case. Tell me what you make of this in terms of the politicization both of the Department of Justice and the FBI, which is a part of that department.
It's bad. We have worked hard to maintain a tradition of independence in investigation and prosecution, and that means that employees, especially career employees who have career civil service protections, cannot be retaliated against for whom they prosecuted, even if that person was the President of the United States, the former President of the United States who's back in office. So if those folks who were fired were career people, civil service protected, then that was unlawful. And they would have a right to be reinstated, provided they wanted to do that. If they were people who were appointed to the Department of Justice for special purposes, then they could be potentially fired. But again, the key point is that we do not want criminal investigation or criminal prosecution to become personalized. I will say, just to be fair, if you ask the Trump folks, what they'll tell you is, what do you mean you don't want it to be personalized? Joe Biden was the president. He had defeated Donald Trump in an election. I guess they don't admit that part, but he'd run against Donald Trump in an election, and he was going to run against him again. And he was criminally prosecuted by the sitting president. So you, the Democrats, are the ones who politicize this. So you can hardly complain about the firing of a few people compared to the prosecution of the former president. And I think it's important to say, although I don't agree with that point of view, I hear it. It is the case that it's hard to maintain non-politicization if you prosecute a former president who's also a candidate for the presidency. So in some sense, what we're seeing is the aftermath of that decision to prosecute, and there's some blame to go around, notwithstanding that I strongly reject the idea that individual agents or prosecutors should be targeted or fired.
But I mean, how does that justify when it comes to the January 6th uprising and insurrection?
I want to weigh in on what they're talking about here. To me, you got a certain set of standards. I'm going to use Tennessee for an example. That if you get caught speeding, it's X amount of points that gets marked against you by the state of Tennessee. If you get caught reckless driving, that point level basically goes up twice as much. If you get caught in a speed zone, I think it actually almost triples. And if I'm not mistaken, the last I looked, it was about 12 points that you're allowed per year. That if you exceed that, your license will be pulled. That is the standard guidelines pertaining to the law in how many violations that you can get. And I may be totally off the charts in what I'm talking about, because all that stuff could have changed. It may not be that many points. But it's a set of standards that the law goes by, that the law themselves are not supposed to break. In other words, they're not supposed to come to your house after you get 8 points or 6 points, or send you a certified letter and then bring an officer out here to take your driver's license from you because somebody in the courts decided, well, we're going to go after that person and get his driver's license taken away from him, even though he didn't get but 8 points, and he could have got, and he was actually tolerated towards getting 12. That's called a certain standard. Whenever our laws become so corrupt that they're willing to bicker, that they're willing to negotiate, that they're willing to actually use one client versus another client pertaining to a trade-off deal because somebody has really upset the apple cart to the degree that they're going to go after that person no matter what. That's called favoritism. So you no longer have the same set of standards. That's the reason why the public continues to say it is a two-tier system, in which it is, based upon who you are, what you got caught doing, and what you can get away with in doing. I'll put it this way. Anybody in the state of Tennessee that's associated with the law, it doesn't matter if it's a deputy on the lowest form, or it doesn't matter if it's somebody up the chain of command, lieutenant, whatever, or even a mayor, or even a judge, or even a state senator or Congress, depending upon what that they have done, they're not going to be reprimanded the way that the general public is ordinarily. They would have had to have really, really done something really, really bad to have gotten the book thrown at them. In other words, that's the reason why you hear of various people that get caught with their hand in the cookie jar that should have got this amount of time or should have got this type of punishment, but they didn't. You know why? Because the system takes care of its own. Just like the system renegotiates with your prosecutors towards, hey, if I can trade this witness off for this witness, hey, why not do that? That way we can get that person or that group of people, that we can get them out of the way, and now we won't have to deal with them. Or they'll make plea bargains with the people that they're trying to put in jail that actually hadn't done nothing and actually cannot prove to be done anything wrong. In other words, it's a gray area there. But out of fear and out of bully tactics, they'll get that person to go ahead and agree to that particular charge, even though that person actually didn't do that. But the way that they'll soften it is that they'll say, well, you won't have to serve no more time and there won't be no more fines. In other words, this is just up and go away. What the people hadn't realized all this time, including myself, until after I got to figuring out the system, that even though you didn't commit the crime, you still admitted to the crime. Because you admitted to the crime, now that can be brought up against you in multiple offenses. As you build up multiple offenses, the time automatically becomes more steeper. The punishment automatically becomes more steeper. Because now you're looked upon as being a multiple offender. But yet now they can plea bargain with people knowing that what that person has done was wrong and it was a very, very obnoxious crime that they committed, just to be able to reach out and grab somebody else that they're actually gunning for or gunning to. I realized how unfair that the system was by not being adjusted to the rule of law whenever I made a telephone call within a few minutes after my probation had ended in contacting Land Between the Lakes Law Enforcement Agency, that they held that against me, even though I did not violate no judge. I did not violate no federal judge's order that had told me, Mr. Jackson, we want you to stay away from these people for X amount of days, for X amount of time. And if you violate that, then that'll be a violation of probation. Well, I didn't violate that. I didn't call them, didn't contact them, didn't get around them, didn't send them no type of emails or none of the above. And for that same group of people, because I made one telephone call to them and then 90 days later made another telephone call to an individual that worked for them but was not associated with the law, he was only a forest ranger, because I had pissed, I guess, a bunch of people off some way or another, and I still say a lot of that's got to do with my dad, because it was my dad that put me on the radar screen whenever I first went back up into that area in 2007. But because, I guess, of the aggravation, it really pissed somebody off, and because of it, they was willing to break the rule of law in basically doing whatever that they wanted to do. That they was going to make an example. Well, we're going to really set an example here for Mr. Jackson, even though he did not technically violate any law. We're going to go after him as if he did, towards charging him with stalking in the first degree over 2 telephone calls that can carry up to 1 to 5 years per telephone call for stalking. You know, based upon the circumstances, based upon the case, let's say that was a marriage, and let's say I'd done already been warned by the judge. Whatever you do not contact your ex-wife, regardless of what circumstances may come about. Do not contact her ever again. She don't want you around her. And I violate that principle. I violate that order. Well, you can kind of halfway see where that would be stalking or agitating that particular person. Even if it was in a unharmful intent, you're still violating the law, because you've already been ordered not to do that. Over my particular situation, I wasn't agitating them people. I wasn't targeting the law enforcement agency up in Land Between the Lakes. I was explaining to them that obviously there was a misunderstanding and that I was going to make my case known. Because I told them that I was going to make my case known, it pissed somebody off that either had worked, is working, or associated with that group of people up there. After the second telephone call was made 90 days later approximately, that's whenever they sure enough huddled up in a huddle and decided, you know what, we're going to do a pile-on. And it don't matter if he didn't actually break the law or not, we're going to do a pile-on because we're agitated with all this, and because of it, we're going after him. And did they ever? Not only did they go after me illegitimately and basically kidnapping me from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and dragging me back to Kentucky, but then on top of that, they poisoned me. They put me on Risperdal that basically made my whole ecosystem inside my body go crazy. I don't know if it was my thyroid, I don't know what it was, but something happened to the degree that I went from 240 to 340 pounds in about 4 or 5 weeks. Of course, whenever you're in jail, you ain't exercising like you ought to. Basically, the only thing that they feed you is the cheapest thing that they can find, which is potatoes. You get potatoes in for breakfast, you get potatoes at lunch, you get potatoes for dinner. You get potatoes. Well, all that starch is nothing but a fat additive that goes into your body to begin with. And if you'll add that on top of the drug that they had given me that did mess up my system, oh man, did I ever suffer. I suffered to the degree that I had an old injury by falling off of a 4-story building at the age of 19 in 1979. That because of that extra weight, it made the gristle and the cartilages in between the ankle, the foot bone, the ankle, and the leg bone deteriorate that much quicker, to the degree that within just a few years of being that weight, and it didn't take long, to where I started rubbing leg bone to ankle bone to foot bone, that was nothing more than misery because of all the weight. Well, because of all the weight, it also created another problem, which was diabetes. None of my family members have ever been diagnosed with diabetes. I've always maintained a decent weight. Even at 240, which was getting unproportionately out of proportion of myself at that time because of the age and etc. I still wasn't what you would consider a over obese person. I was an overweight person, but not a over obese person. Whenever they gave me that Risperdal, which basically done something to my system that the drug has been sued all over America because of, the manufacturer that manufactured the drug, it made so much weight come up onto me that they brought that much more extra pain and misery into my life just because I made a non-threatening telephone call. Now, if that ain't cruel, if that ain't violation of their own laws, if that ain't evil people that's willing to destroy an individual's life that way, I'll kiss your tail and give you 30 minutes to draw up a crowd. Because that's exactly what they was doing illegitimately. And then I come back here to Northwest Tennessee in 2014 and get attacked again and again and again and again and again by all these different people around in the neighborhood, tried to provoke either my brother or myself in basically violating the law, putting the law into our own hands. When in the meantime, we're begging, even hiring attorneys to try to get the law in the state of Tennessee, in this county, to saddle up with us, to help us. And instead, they were just letting it go by. In other words, they was deliberately allowing for it to happen, allowing for it to fester, allowing for it to become a problem, to a worse problem, to the worstest of the worst of problems. That way, Mr. Jackson or David Jackson or somebody out here would have been subode in going ahead and violating the principles of the law and basically putting the law into their own hands. That way, even though Mr. Jackson would have settled the score, and it didn't matter which one it was, David or Dennis, they would have basically been shooting themselves in the foot. Because why? Because the majority of the neighborhood around here, including the judges, including the authorities up here in Weakley County, was against me all along, pertaining to the Windmill Ministries missions. That the Windmill Ministries missions has always been for the things in the King James Version Bible regarding love, grace, mercy, forgiveness, and also the teachings of Revelations. Because I was teaching on the book of Revelations, I was basically being judged according to the subject matter in which what I was teaching. And they was trying so desperately to image me in the eyes of the general public of being a harm to myself and a harm to the general public. That was their whole initiative after 9/11. Now, before 9/11, their initiative was, well, if we can declare him unfit towards being a lunatic, even though he's not a harm to himself and he's not a harm to society, nobody will listen to him because they're going to think that he's a nut anyway. That's called character assassination. That began in Kenton, Tennessee in 1983, whenever I went to try to get help, and instead of getting help, I got marked. I got reprimanded. Even though it was my biological dad that should have been the one that got reprimanded, because you don't attack a patient that's got 64 staples up and down his belly that 2 weeks prior to that, he just got through almost losing his life by losing 9 units of blood over a car accident. I can see where I have been violated again and again. It didn't matter if it was way back when. It didn't matter whenever I come back here to Tennessee in 2014. It didn't matter if it was in Kentucky. It didn't matter if it was before 20 and 12, whenever the charges first come at me, or the charges before that, which was the federal charges in 20 and 10, or the other charges that they tried to get me for in 20 and 7 towards trying to help these people by telling them that God had shown me that there was going to be electrical disturbances. I can see where I was sincere in wanting to help the people, while the whole time they was trying to image me, beginning with Homeland Security Secret Service in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1991, towards me being a harm to society. There's a pattern, regardless whether it's the federal government, state governments, or local governments, of what that they have done pertaining to trying to make me out to be a monster, and the whole time, instead of Dennis James Jackson being the monster, instead of David Jeffrey Jackson being the monster, the whole time it was the people in the surrounding neighborhoods that was attacking us the way that they was, and it was the judicial system in this area that was allowing for it to occur. And it went on and went on and went on for 3 consecutive years, to the point that I truly believe that it had a profound effect upon my brother's life, dying prematurely at the age of 51. Going to work, coming home, and dying. Because of the stress, the level of stress that had befallen up into his life, that me and him had talked about several times. Several times, that Juby, my brother said, David, Juby, the only way that they're going to run me off of this property is in a body bag. And that's exactly the only way that they got David Jeffrey Jackson out of the community, out of the sight of public domain, was to basically haunt him and chew at him and gnaw at him, to the point that they basically broke him down. And whenever you break somebody down psychologically, whenever you break them down emotionally, you also break them down physically. And I truly believe that that had a profound effect upon my brother's death at the age of 51. And I'll always believe that. And one day I'll clarify that in the heavens, because God knowed exactly who it was, what that they was doing, how many times that they was doing it, and how many times that the law was basically being liberal in allowing for it to happen, as far as we was concerned, that was wanting it to escalate and become even worser. Once more, I had become a target because of various other complications with other agencies throughout the country, regardless whether it was in Oklahoma, Kentucky, Atlanta, or Tennessee. And because of it, I was targeted by my own people in my own county that I didn't have no say-so over, towards my parents bringing me to, that I've tried to be a decent human being. I know that I'm not perfect, but I'm not a robber. I'm not a rapist. I haven't never made no drugs. I haven't sold no drugs. I haven't attempted to sell no drugs. I don't make moonshine. I don't make counterfeit money. I'm not out here trying to hoodoo people or blackball them or hurt them in any form or fashion. But yet, no, I've still got certain people in this neighborhood that is dead set that they're going to try everything in the world to prove to themselves and others that I'm a monster, even though the whole time I've been preaching in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. But because of the subject matter in what I've been teaching on, it made these people turn against me. And whenever they turned against me, that is considered not necessarily psychological warfare, but spiritual warfare, because something within them, even though they didn't know why they hated me, had never done nothing to them. And even the courts up here in Weakley County would question certain people, well, what has Dennis done to you? What has David or Dennis done to you that makes you feel this way? And they couldn't give an answer. You know why? Because the devil's people automatically hates God's people. For they will persecute you for my name's sake, is what Jesus said, and that's exactly what they was doing. And they was expressing their actions, they was expressing their feelings by not being able to restrain themselves. I had people shooting at me over here less than a quarter of a mile while I was driving down the road. I had people confronting me, getting all in my face. I had people that wanted to duke it out right here in the road, that would purposely stop and target me. Why? Christ said that if they hated me, they'll hate you. No ifs, ands, buts about it. None of these people. I've never sold cars. I've never wanted to sell cars. And I for darn sure hadn't beat nobody on no car deal. I don't get out here and prowl around. I'm not trying to get involved in people's business. I'm not being flirtery with people's wives or their daughters. I'm none of the above. But I have been attacked as if I was a criminal. And that's exactly what certain people wanted to do, including the courts. Not just in the state of Tennessee, but Kentucky and Oklahoma. Including the courts that wanted to criminalize an individual because of his beliefs. That's the reason why it states what it states in the first 3 chapters of Revelations, that Satan will throw some of you into prison. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. That's the reason why Christ told his disciples, think it not what to say whenever they shall arrest you and throw you before their courts and their judges. Christ said, don't meditate on what to say, because in that hour I will give you the wisdom and the knowledge and what to say and how to say it. So it was God the Father that got me out of every one of those close encounters, and I look at them as skirmishes, spiritual skirmishes, towards people that was trying to destroy me simply because of the anointing or the calling that the Heavenly Father had called up into my life. Now, whenever it gets so bad in America that you're dealing with these unwanted spirits, with these evil barbarian spirits, and they can come at you in 1,000 zillion different ways, that's whenever these people are knocking on the door towards the wrath of God falling down upon them in flaming fire, taking vengeance upon them who know not God and upon them who obey not the gospel. And that's exactly what took place and will take place again and again until these demons realizes that they are losers, they have failed, and they're got a destiny of hell that they're going to be going to because of it. No ifs, ands, buts about it. No guesses. No question marks. It's done been chiseled in stone what their destiny is going to be.
The criminal trials.
And that's the reason why they're pissed. And that's the reason why in the last days, the days that we're living in right now, the Bible says that they will come down in great wrath because they know that their time is short. They know. They know what's coming to them. They know. Regardless whether they be average old Joe out here, or a banker, or a lawyer, or a judge, or a senator, they know what's coming to them.
Is there some argument that was a political thing as opposed to just...
No, I don't think there's a credible argument. I mean, you may hear it from hardcore Trump supporters, but I don't think that's credible. You know, we saw on television what happened on January 6th. Those trials were public trials with all of the evidence brought to bear, and it was very clear what folks had done. And those criminal prosecutions were, I think, entirely legitimate and appropriate. And, Donald Trump has pardoned effectively all of the people who were criminally prosecuted there, which tells you that he's the one who's politicizing those prosecutions in retrospect.
We saw a headline in the New York Times this week that was, somewhat was taken aback by it. It said Trump's actions have created a constitutional crisis. Skull.
I'm ashamed of both of them. I'm ashamed of one side as I am the other side. I'm ashamed of the Democrats as much as I am the Republicans. I'm ashamed of the whole charade. And it basically falls right back to what various other people have brought to the attention of the media, that we're dealing with a two-tier system. Nobody has a standard to go by anymore, and they basically make up their own rules and regulations as they go. And if they don't want to persecute somebody, even though they should, they still don't. And if they persecute somebody, even though they shouldn't, and they do, they still do it anyway, based upon likes and dislikes, based upon being biased, based upon spiritual, intellectual, emotional warfare. It's gotten bad, and it was really, really bad before Donald Trump ever got onto the scene, because during Obama's administration, it had gotten so bad after Bill Clinton's administration and the Bush's administration that if you had a lascivity scene out in your yard pertaining to Christ, Virgin Mary, and the three wise men, you was prone of going to jail. People was being vandalized all over this country because they was putting crosses up, or they was putting lascivity scenes for Christmas up, and it was the next thing before they was going to start going to jail. Kind of like California, that's already reached their state court regarding trying to outlaw or abolish the King James Version Bible out of the state. You keep doing that and doing that and doing that. You keep beating and disrespecting God and God's people, and God will show you what disrespect is about. Just like He has showed other cultures, just like He has showed other generations that thought that they could get away with this too as well. You wonder how come it's nothing but hell over there in the Middle East? It's because of their lifestyle. You wonder how come it's hell in all these other different countries? Because it's their lifestyle. You wonder how come it's hell over here in America? Because of our lifestyle. The Bible says that He will give you over to a reprobate mind and allow for you to believe a lie and be damned. It's not because He desires that. It says in the Bible that God would prefer that all be saved and that none would perish. But after a person or a group or a country decides that they're going to go in a certain direction, well, then basically God says, okay, you go ahead and do that. But by doing that, you realize that you're going to face the consequences on account of doing that. In other words, don't expect for me to bless your crops with adequate rain in the summer. Don't expect for me to prevent from diseases coming into your lives. Don't expect for me to do this and to do that. Reason why is because you're no longer being obedient to God. And if you're no longer obedient to God, then God no longer has to be obedient to you. Now, anybody can go around announcing the name of Jesus Christ. Even the devil fears and trembles under His name. But just because you claim that you're a believer, don't necessarily mean that you have a true relationship with God to the degree that God has to protect you. It's only certain people like Job that God said, you can do whatever you want to with him, but you cannot kill him. That was the dividing line that Satan knew that he could not cross. And to this day, it's the bloodline of Christ that prevents any of us that's truly walking in Christ, for Christ, that prevents the devil from basically eradicating us. Because I guarantee you, every morning whenever people like me wake up, it gives Satan, the Luciferian Lucifer, a migraine headache. And I hope that I continue to give that evil demonic spirit torment from the time that I'm living, from the time that I'm dead. And even after I'm dead in the hereafter world, I intend to bring torment to this evil demonic spirit that has brought torment into the children of God. I feel like that it's my duty, because I've sided up with the Lord Jesus Christ towards being for Christ, not anti-Christ. So it's going to come a time in every individual's life that they're going to have to pick and choose what side they're going to be on, and they better be good fighters in whatever side that you're on. If you're for the wicked, go for it. But make up your mind which side that you're going to be on, because the battle has already been won. We, the Christians, just have to proclaim it.
Scholars say. You're kind of indicating you don't think it's yet a constitutional crisis. Tell me what you think the ingredients are for a real constitutional crisis and how that's being played out now.
A constitutional crisis exists when two things happen. The first thing is you have two different branches of government. They're staring at each other, and no one knows under the rules of the game what's going to happen next. An example would be that a court orders the president to do something, the president says no. Now they're staring at each other, the court and the president, and there's no written answer in the Constitution of what's supposed to resolve that. It's not like Congress can come in as the third player and resolve it. We don't know exactly what's supposed to happen. And then the second component has to be that both of the people staring at each other, or both of the branches staring at each other, are willing to take this all the way to the end. Neither is going to blink the way, for example, Richard Nixon ultimately blinked when the courts required him to turn over the Watergate tapes. He blinked by handing over the tapes, or almost all of the tapes, and then subsequently, when things got really bad, he resigned, which is another form of backing down. So we don't have those two factors right now. We could. It could happen. There were moments when it seemed to be happening in the first Trump administration, although we got through them. So it's not impossible that we could come to a constitutional crisis. But I think it's important to save those words for a situation when things are really at the brink. Because if we overuse those words, we're going to dilute their meaning. And when we get a real constitutional crisis, and people like me are waving our arms and saying, now is the time, everyone should.
In other words, it's the little boy that cried wolf too many times.
Irving.
I understand. I fully understand what he's trying to say.
Irving for the circumstances that I described, where we really don't know what's going to happen next, and neither side seems prepared to back down.
And you don't feel we're there yet?
We're not there yet because we don't have an open defiance of a judicial order. We don't have the administration refusing to follow the law. What we have is the administration doing a lot of things.
In other words, civil war hadn't broken out yet.
Lawful, sometimes only in a technical sense, but they were still unlawful. And we have courts saying, that's unlawful, you can't do that. And so if at the next phase, the Trump administration basically complies, revamps those plans, does them differently, restarts the pause the way they've done in the funding, then there won't have been a crisis. And I'm sure we'll run into other problems. You know, there are plenty of things a president can do that are lawful but incredibly bad and incredibly foolish, and Trump has already done a few of them, and my guess is he'll do more. But that's, again, different from a constitutional crisis. That might just be a good old ordinary governance crisis, you know, when the president is doing things that are bad for the country.
Professor Noah Feldman, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me, Walter.
Good luck to all of us. And shalom. Good luck.
Was the tale